The year is around 1025 AD. You're standing somewhere in the middle of what we now call Australia, and your jaw just hit the floor. No roads, no cities, no Wi-Fi. Just the most wild, alive, and ancient landscape on the planet, stretching as far as your eyes can see. Today we're going back 1,000 years into Australia's past. Today we're going to see exactly how life and nature looked in Australia 1,000 years ago. The untouched wilderness, the megafauna roaming free, the ancient Aboriginal cultures living in perfect harmony with the land, and so much more. And trust me, what we find is going to absolutely blow your mind. Climate and landscape. Let's start with the big picture, the land itself. Now, here's something that might surprise you. Australia, 1,000 years ago, actually looked remarkably similar to today in some ways, but dramatically different in others. The continent had already been dry for millions of years. The ancient interior, the red center, was still a sweeping desert of rust-colored sand, towering sandstone formations and flat-topped mesas that glowed orange at sunrise like something out of a fantasy novel. The climate around the year 1000 AD was sitting right in the middle of what scientists call the medieval warm period. Global temperatures were slightly elevated, which in Australia meant certain regions were experiencing more unpredictable rainfall patterns. The monsoon-drenched north, what we now call the top end and the Kimberley, was even lusher and more flooded than today, with seasonal floodplains that transformed into enormous inland lakes practically overnight. Meanwhile, the south and southeast enjoyed a relatively cooler, wetter climate compared to what we see now. Places like modern-day Victoria and Tasmania were thick with temperate rainforest, mossy, dripping, ancient, the kind of forest that feels like it has a heartbeat. The Great Dividing Range ran along the eastern coast just as it does today, but without the cleared farmland and urban sprawl. Those slopes were completely blanketed in uninterrupted eucalyptus forest all the way down to coastal wetlands. The coastline itself was slightly different too. Sea levels had fluctuated over thousands of years, and in some areas, land that's now underwater was still dry ground just a few thousand years before our visit. Australia in 1025 AD was enormous, ancient, and in many places absolutely untouched. Wildlife. Okay, now, here is where things get seriously exciting. The animals. Australia's wildlife in 1025 AD was extraordinary, and in some ways it was actually more diverse than what we see today. The continent was still home to species that have since become extinct or been pushed to the very edges of survival. Let's talk megafauna first. Because while the really big stuff like Diprotodon, the giant wombat the size of a hippopotamus, had already gone extinct thousands of years earlier, there were still impressive large animals roaming the land. The Tasmanian tiger, also known as the thylacine, was absolutely alive and thriving, and not just in Tasmania. Evidence suggests that 1,000 years ago, thylacines may still have existed in small pockets of mainland Australia, particularly in remote areas of Western Australia and the Northern Territory. Imagine seeing one of those striped dog-like marsupials slipping through the shadows of the bush. Incredible. Now, here's the map comparison you've been waiting for. If you pulled out a map of where certain animals lived then versus now, the differences would be striking. The quoll, that spotted carnivorous marsupial, once ranged across almost the entire continent. Today it's restricted to pockets of Tasmania, some coastal areas, and parts of northern Queensland. The bilby, that adorable rabbit-eared creature, once hopped across 2/3 of Australia. Today it survives in less than 20% of its original range. Crocodiles in 1025 AD had a broader coastal presence in the north than today. Areas that are now suburban coastline were once patrolled by massive saltwater crocodiles. Birds like the night parrot and the paradise parrot were widespread across the interior. Today, one is critically endangered and the other is believed to be extinct. The map, if you drew it honestly, would go from a big, colorful spread of life to a series of small, fragmented islands of survival. It's a sobering picture. But back in 1025, kangaroos in massive mobs rolling across the plains, echidnas waddling through every forest type, wedge-tailed eagles circling thermals over the desert, and coastal waters absolutely teeming with dugongs, sharks, turtles, and fish of every description. Plant life. The plant life of Australia 1,000 years ago was staggering in its diversity and health. Without European farming, large-scale land clearing, or introduced species like rabbits and foxes, the native flora was in peak condition, shaped over millennia by fire, drought, and the careful management of the Aboriginal people. The eucalyptus, or gum tree, was king. In the forests of the east and south, enormous old-growth gums towered above the understory, some of them hundreds of years old even by 1025 AD. The Blue Mountains west of the coast were draped in such dense eucalyptus forest that the volatile oils released by the leaves literally created a blue haze in the air. That haze is where the mountains got their name, a name Aboriginal people had given the landscape long before. Across the interior, spinifex grasses spread in golden domes across red sand plains, while mulga woodlands, those tough, silver-gray acacia trees, covered vast areas of the semi-arid zone. In the tropical north, paperbark forests lined the floodplains, their pale, peeling trunks reflected in still water. And in the southwest corner of the continent, one of the world's biodiversity hotspots, wildflowers bloomed in color combinations that would make any florist weep with joy. The rivers and waterways of Australia in 1025 AD were, in many places, far more alive than they are today. The Murray-Darling system, the biggest river network on the continent, ran cleaner, stronger, and more naturally than it does in our era of dams, irrigation diversions, and agricultural runoff. River red gums lined the banks in thick corridors of shade, their roots gripping the water's edge, their canopies home to enormous colonies of waterbirds, herons, ibis, spoonbills, cormorants, nesting in noisy, chaotic abundance. The wetlands of Kakadu in the north, still one of the most spectacular places on Earth, were, if anything, even more expansive. The floodwaters that spread across the lowlands each wet season created a vast, shallow inland sea where geese, magpie geese, jabiru and brolgas gathered in numbers that would take your breath away. Aboriginal communities along these waterways had developed extraordinarily sophisticated systems for fishing, stone fish traps, woven nets, spearing platforms, some of which were maintained across generations and are still visible today as archaeological features in the landscape. Freshwater springs in the desert, fed by the ancient underground Great Artesian Basin, created isolated oases, tiny pockets of green life surrounded by red sand. And these springs were sacred, precious, and carefully stewarded. Social life. Now let's talk about the people, because Australia in 1025 AD was home to one of the oldest, most sophisticated, and most deeply connected cultures in human history. Aboriginal Australians had been living on this continent for at least 65,000 years. Let that number sink in for a second. When we're talking about 1,000 years ago, we're talking about a culture already 64,000 years deep in its own story. Across the continent, there were hundreds of distinct nations, each with their own language, law, ceremony, and country. Population estimates suggest that somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million people called Australia home in this era, living in smaller mobile or semi-mobile groups that moved seasonally across their country, following resources with expert precision. This wasn't wandering, it was highly organized, intergenerational environmental knowledge passed down through story, song, and ceremony. Trade networks crisscrossed the continent in ways that would surprise you. Shell ornaments from the tropical north have been found in archaeological sites in South Australia. Grinding stones, ochre, and food resources moved along well-established routes. Ceremonies like the Bora brought neighboring groups together for trading, for marriages, for settling disputes, for sharing knowledge. It was a continent alive with relationship and connection. The dreaming, the spiritual and philosophical framework at the heart of Aboriginal cultures, wasn't just religion. It was law, science, history, and art all in one. Songlines mapped the landscape in incredible detail. You could navigate hundreds of kilometers of country by following the sequence of a song. That, friends, is next-level GPS. Housing. So, where did everyone sleep? This is where a lot of people have the wrong idea. Aboriginal Australians in 1025 AD weren't all living in simple bark lean-tos and calling it a day. The diversity of shelter across the continent was remarkable, and some of it was genuinely impressive architecture. In cooler regions like Victoria and Tasmania, semi-permanent stone and timber structures were built. Some communities constructed villages of dome-shaped huts using bent saplings, bark, and grass thatching that could house families comfortably through cold winters. In Western Victoria, near what is now Budge Bim, Aboriginal communities had constructed extensive stone channels and weirs to manage eel farming, a form of aquaculture that's among the oldest in the world. The communities there had permanent stone houses clustered near their fish traps. Permanent stone houses 1,000 years ago. In the tropical north, lighter structures made from paper bark, pandanus leaves, and timber were perfect for the climate, well ventilated, quick to build, and easily relocated when seasonal movements required. In the desert, small windbreaks of brush and bark were sufficient for mild nights, while caves and overhangs, many decorated with paintings and engravings, provided shelter during extreme weather. The landscape of Australia in 1025 AD wasn't empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a managed, inhabited, deeply known homeland. Every rock, every waterhole, every tree had a name, a story, and a custodian. And honestly, when you understand that, the Australia of 1,000 years ago doesn't just look different. It feels alive in a way that's hard to describe and impossible to forget. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more interesting content. Bye-bye.